صباح الفل. Welcome. How are you? So Bassma here. Oh, wow. So we do have Robert here. That's good. So Andrea hasn't given me anything particular. I presume there was nothing in particular beyond this.
No. No.
Ah, welcome.
Hey.
That's all right. I see it. Okay. Hello. How are you?
يا روبرتو أهلا بيك.
ازيك؟ سعادة السفير. It looks like the doors are closing. Shall we get underway? And I'm afraid I don't know the hashtags at pound AC here. It is. Sounds like our microphones are live. They are. Very good. Then let us get underway. Let me welcome everyone. As usual, we have a very distinguished audience to match our distinguished panel. So thank you all for coming to the Atlantic Council for our presentation today of major policy work by the authors themselves, setting the stage for peace in Syria, a much bigger and even more ambitious and difficult proposition than simply how to arm an army to overturn the current regime. The very title gives the recognition of the project being a long-term and constructive one, as well as one that is premised on the need for the transition to actually happen. And it's all about not only how to make that happen, but then what to do about it and what to have in place to deal with it. So welcome to everyone. I will remind all the members of the audience and the panelists that we are on the record. There are members of the media present. It is more than permissible. It's encouraged if people want to tweet during this session. And I'm going to need someone to correct me, but because I'm doing this from memory, I think the hashtag is #AC Syria. Is that correct, Samia? Hashtag AC Syria. I think of it as the pound sign. Thank you. Those of us of a certain age think of it as pound. It is hashtag AC Syria. I'm not going to repeat the bios because you have them all printed out there, and I'm going to guess that everyone in an audience as sophisticated as this knows, in many cases, have met one, if not each, of the speakers that are with us today. But we're very happy to have the three authors, starting immediately to my left, longtime friend and colleague, Fred Hoff, with an astonishing career inside an inside uniform and outside uniform. Dr. Bassma Kodmani, who can speak not only as a Syrian but as a European, because the United States and Europe are in this together with partners in the region, and it's good to have an authentic voice truly from the inside who brings a global perspective and an inside perspective. Thank you, Dr. Bassma, for joining us. And then Jeffrey White, also one of Washington's great experts on strategic affairs, military in the region. Cell phones off, please, as ever. And let me turn it over to Fred Hoff to begin.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks very much. And obviously, on behalf of my co-authors, I'd like to thank you all for coming out on this rainy afternoon and being with us as we launch this report. Obviously, in this room, there are many, many, many different points of view about what needs to be done in Syria. But I think that we're all allied in the battle fighting Syria fatigue. We may have differences about what is to be done, but I think none of us here would dispute that Syria is the premier humanitarian catastrophe of the 21st century. It's a textbook in the protection of civilians. No one would dispute that Syria, in its present condition, is a profound threat to the peace of the region and beyond. And I think no one would dispute the proposition that degrading and destroying ISIL, our president's objective, will not be possible absent legitimate governance emerging in Iraq and Syria. My co-authors and I have tried to do something that's a bit difficult. It's easy to be a critic. It's not so easy outside of government to propose policy alternatives that are actually useful to people inside government. Our report seeks to adjust policy in a practical way to make it more consistent with the stated objectives of the President of the United States and other national leaders identifying themselves as friends of the Syrian people. Ours is inevitably an imperfect product, yet it's one that sincerely aims to offer a feasible alternative to a policy that does not, in our view, succeed in attaining its objectives. Nearly 3 years ago, President Obama considered the recommendation of his chief foreign policy advisors that the United States undertake a robust effort to arm, train, and equip Syrian nationalist rebels operating under the rubric of the Free Syrian Army. Our president's advisors saw the nationalist rebels as the natural enemies not only of a regime already at that time neck deep in war crimes and crimes against humanity, but against an al-Qaeda in Iraq beginning to manifest itself in Syria under various names. The president did not accept the recommendation. In June 2014, things changed. ISIL, which had managed to dominate central and eastern Syria over poorly supported and depleted nationalist rebel units, swept through Iraq from secure bases in Syria. President Obama now proposed training and equipping nationalists to fight ISIL in Syria, to provide that component for coalition air forces. As conceived by the administration, these forces would focus on ISIL while fending off the Assad regime and providing a basis for negotiations between the regime and its nationalist political opposition. Congress would eventually approve a proposal to train and equip some 5,000 rebel soldiers per year over a 3-year period. My co-authors and I fully agree with the administration's position that the Assad regime cannot be a partner in the battle against ISIL. The regime's survival strategy made Syria safe for ISIL. The regime works in virtual tandem with ISIL to try to erase Syria's armed nationalist opposition. The regime is the embodiment of illegitimate governance. We agree with President Obama's Brisbane characterization of Bashar al-Assad as a mass murderer. And we agree with Ambassador Samantha Power's recent statement in Kuwait that two countries, unnamed but clearly Iran and Russia, are accomplices in the regime's program of mass murder. We do not believe the train and equip program as currently conceived can accomplish the objectives set for it. It's too small, and it's too slow. 15,000 soldiers, even if available, might be useful against ISIL, were they and the civilians they try to protect not under constant attack by regime forces and by foreign fighters assembled by Iran. but they're not available. And the prospect of chasing ISIL in Syria for 3 years from 30,000 feet while they are trained and equipped is profoundly active. It would be far better, in my view, were the United States able now to assemble regional ground forces to sweep ISIL from Syria. An alternate could be established in areas liberated, and Assad's air force could be prevented from terrorizing civilians. This could provide a basis for genuine negotiations and permit Syrians, with the help from friends, to build a truly national army that could ultimately stabilize the country if negotiations were to fall short. If, however, train and equip is the way forward, then we propose to put it on steroids. To do so efficiently will require secure areas in Syria protected from regime air attacks and from ground attacks mounted by the regime, ISIL, and other extremists. This will require American leadership, not American boots on the ground. President Obama told coalition defense chiefs at Andrews Joint Base several months ago that the fight against ISIL, quote, will require us developing and strengthening a moderate opposition inside Syria, in a position then to bring about the kind of legitimacy and sound governance for all people inside of Syria, unquote. He knew then, as he knows now, that this will not happen on its own. It will require secure areas protected from the regime, ISIL, and other extremists. And only days ago, with Tom Friedman of the New York Times, President Obama elevated the protection of civilians from barrel bombs to a core American interest. My co-authors and I believe that the words of the American Commander-in-Chief matter. We believe they mandate follow-up action if credibility and reputation are to be preserved. Our effort aims at arming our friends in government with implementable ideas that would enable President Obama to do what he says he wants to do. We're recommending, therefore, that the United States and its partners aim higher than train and equip. We think initial planning should shoot for a 50,000-person Syrian National Stabilization Force organized into 3 motorized infantry divisions. This force would have the military mission of defeating any combination of enemies obstructing the stabilization of Syria. It would have robust combat capabilities and civil military skills. It would likely require assistance, both combat support and logistical, from external supporters. Ideally, such a force would grow larger as it attracts from the regime officers and soldiers who have resisted participating in war crimes and crimes against humanity, and who would welcome an alternative to life in a refugee camp. Such a force must stand for political principles attractive to those Syrians still grudgingly supporting the regime because they see no alternative. Ideally, such a force would help build legitimate, pluralistic governance in a united Syria. And yes, it will take time to build it. We cannot entirely solve the too slow aspect of an initiative that was rejected in the summer of 2012, resurrected in June 2014, and still awaiting implementation. Acceleration is possible, and safe zones can jumpstart matters by organizing existing units and accessing recruiting bases directly. But time lost is never fully recoverable. So whether we stick with train and equip as currently conceived or transform it into something more meaningful, Syrian input and guidance will be absolutely critical. If we seek to create a foreign auxiliary for foreign objectives, we will fail. If we try to recruit and vet solely on the basis of American knowledge, we will fail. Over the past 4 years, American officials have come to know Syrians in and out of the formal opposition who are knowledgeable, sensible, practical, collegial, and committed to a pluralistic Syria reflecting rule of law. In the absence of an alternate Syrian government or a fully functioning opposition, we could pull together an advisory task force of prominent Syrians to help guide an effort which, if it lacks Syrian identity and Syrian input, will fail. This task force would disappear when a Syrian National Command Authority emerges to take charge of the National Stabilization Force. Nothing we are proposing precludes the negotiated political process President Obama seeks. Indeed, the Syrian National Stabilization Force, even perhaps the promise of one, could provide the missing element to change regime calculations, or perhaps those of its Iranian masters, about the value and utility of a complete negotiated political transition. Train and equip, as currently conceived, cannot do it. It cannot do what the president says he wants done. Again, thank you all for doing us the honor of participating in this launch, and that concludes my remarks. Thank you, Frank.
Very good. Doctora?
Thank you. I had the privilege to be part of this project and to participate in imagining what the Syrian contribution in particular could be in putting together such a Syrian stabilization force composed only of Syrians. I think this was clear from what Fred Hoff has just presented. The point of departure was this is a situation today, after 4 years, that presents us with no party having the capacity to restore stability to Syria. Neither the opposition, as everyone knows, nor the regime. As we are, I think, discovering more and more clearly, the disintegration, the slow disintegration, but fairly clear now, of regime forces' cohesion is also an indication that there is no capacity on the regime side either to see Syria stabilized and law and order brought back, security brought back to the population as well as to its neighbors, making of Syria something else than what General Petraeus called a Chernobyl, that is a radioactive area poisoning, really, the overall region. So the point of departure is this capacity does not exist. And I, as an opposition figure, would say if tomorrow morning I were told Bashar al-Assad is gone, has died, has escaped, I will be extremely concerned, not because he's gone. It will be a relief. It may be the beginning of something, but it definitely isn't a scenario that we can describe as what we can do to stabilize Syria. So the idea of a stabilization force is about avoiding something that will look like Libya, or worse, or like Yemen today, or any of the scenarios. The Iraqi one is the third interesting theater at which we can look to see that this capacity needs to be built in order to make any solution possible. The second argument we make is there is only one player, one party that can do that, whether we like it or not. And I will tell you, as Syrians, we don't really like it because this is not our political culture, but it is the United States. And we have gone through 4 years of conflict. We have seen each and every player in the region organize its own efforts and strategy and choose groups on the ground to serve different agendas that do not suit the reality of Syrian society. And therefore, we have seen that much, much money has been spent on supporting certain groups, on pushing certain agendas, on creating certain realities on the ground, which have not served stability in any way, nor served really a change of the balance of forces between the regime and the opposition. So the point here is, if we want to see the different players on the ground work in the same direction, we are in need of a comprehensive, coherent strategy that says, this is what we need to do. This is where the resources are needed. Here is where they should be put, and it is towards this goal that we need to work. The Syrians on their own cannot go in a direction that the regional players do not want to see happen. Even if they wanted it very badly and very strongly, I don't believe they can do it. But for them to work together, there is some improvement, there is some cooperation between the regional players on the opposition side. And these players have not yet joined forces to work in the same direction for the simple reason that there is no viable strategy that appears worth investing their efforts and their resources in that direction. And when we talk about resources, we know how important these resources can be, coming particularly from the Gulf countries. Only the US would be in a position to align these countries in one direction. And this is not for me to tell, but there is here, I think, some underestimation of how important that signal from Washington is for all the players in the region. It is, from the regional perspective, it is a given that if that signal comes, the players on the ground will understand and will, I think, there's a strong probability that they will cooperate in this and work in the same direction. But for this US policy to succeed, it also needs a Syrian partner. And the big missing link seemed to be, who is this Syrian partner? The Syrian partner is in the opposition at the moment, 3 existing structures which are fairly dysfunctional, as Fred Hoff himself, as Robert Ford present here, as others have experienced. The work with opposition structures has not been easy, always productive. We have an opposition coalition, a political coalition. We have a Supreme Military Council, Joint Chief of Staff. and we have an interim government. None of these three structures, and they themselves admit that they are not functioning properly. For a variety of reasons in which I will not now get into, none of these structures is in a situation today to provide an interlocutor who can commit the whole structure to any particular decision. We therefore have imagined in this report the formation of a Syrian advisory task force, which would keep an informal profile, would not have any particular titles, would not have any power, if we want to talk about any power. Anyway, none of the opposition structures at the moment you would recognize has any power, but this structure would not claim to have any power over anything, but be that link that brings to a strategy of this nature a view of the situation on the ground, of the forces on the ground, that is accurate, that is updated on a very regular basis, that gives an account, a precise account of what is going on, and is able to know the history of the fighting forces on the ground. Over 4 years, they have evolved. They have changed not sides, but changed groups sometimes, or they have been left without the means to fight. Some of them are sitting idle in refugee camps in Turkey and Jordan, but a lot inside as well. The task force would also be the one that can say what criteria are the most valid if the vetting process is to succeed. I think we have had a hanging question about what are these criteria? And until now, I do not know of a set of criteria that the Train and Equip program has developed. And that is perhaps something I have missed, but so far I have not seen such a set of criteria, and it seems that this is a problematic area to define what these criteria are. If I were to give the number one criterion here, I think it would be the embeddedness in the social environment of groups which, from the beginning of the uprising in 2011 until today, have not changed in nature, have not changed ideologically particularly, have not changed in what they have been doing and how they relate to the population. And that criterion of how they relate to the civil population, whether they have the support of the civilians or not, is a key one, because it indicates when they evolve, they go towards ideological groups, most of the time they lose this kind of social embeddedness. And I think this is an important factor here. But I will not insist too much on this one. I think what a task force needs to have is a discourse, a Syrian discourse, about what this is what the plan is for such a stabilization force, projecting in the future. Such a stabilization force, as I said, is to create capacity to restore order, security, and law in different regions, perhaps gradually, perhaps in a large area, depending whether there is a protected zone, no protected zones. But basically, its role is to say this is part of a larger national Syrian force, security force, whether this is the army and the security forces, whether this is paramilitary groups that will need to be deployed in different regions, whether it is local policing. All of this needs to be part of a plan for stabilizing Syria in the future, particularly the National Syrian Army, the loyalist, what we call today still the loyalist army, which stays in control of the Assad regime. many of the officers in the army are in contact with defectors to say, we would like to leave, but to go where? What is the alternative? What is on offer? If there is a project to defect to, we will defect towards such a project. But for now, we have a salary, we have income, we have some form of safety for ourselves and our families. So the absence of an alternative has also left the situation in an impasse for such a long time. And finally, I would say stabilize is in order to render a political process possible. What we have also lacked in the train and equip program, it is slow, the resources are not enough, but what also lacks is a discourse. We do not have a discourse coming out of Washington that says this is designed to achieve, and I think I continue to have a big question mark there. I do not have an answer to that. All we hear is it will take a very long time. It will take years to defeat ISIS. In the meantime, someone on the ground is listening to this discourse. Two sides are listening to this discourse. One is the opposition, and he sees no prospect of any solution. And the other is, of course, the regime. We have not heard this kind of discourse that accompanies a strategy, even a modest strategy of train and equip. Without such a discourse, I think we continue to have a monolithic attitude coming out from Russia and coming out of Tehran. Now, there is no idealism here or any overly optimistic evaluation, assessment of Iran's attitude or Russia's attitude. But from experience and from contacts, the message we get from both countries is, if you want the moderates inside our countries to be heard, to prevail, we need to have a signal coming out of Washington. If there is a signal of resolve, of determination coming out of Washington, we the moderates in Russia, we the moderates in Iran, would be able to push to advocate for engaging with the opposition and for a political process that involves concessions on the part of the regime. Going to Moscow or going to Geneva, perhaps Moscow is a good attempt because Moscow forces Russia to admit where the obstacle comes from, but it will not go very far if we have it in the current political, military situation on the ground and with a discourse that is really self-defeating that we have heard so far coming out from, particularly here in Washington, where everybody in Syria, without liking it always, look to see what the signal will be. Again, from Europe, as Frank Ricciardoni was suggesting that I also mention the European role, there is an eagerness to play some positive, some significant role and take some significant move. The Europeans are in face more of a security challenge as a result of the situation in Syria from two origins, which I will not dwell on those. They're very obvious. One is the jihadis who are come across the Mediterranean, come and go to Syria. And the second is, of course, the refugees drowning every other week in the Mediterranean along the Italian coasts. With these two, the Europeans simply cannot ignore the situation, and at the same time, they don't see how they could take any initiative that would make any difference on the ground. We therefore have also a set of players, the regional ones, but also the Europeans, waiting for some signal. They, I believe, and others in this room may be able to add to that, they do have the resources and the political will to invest in a strategy to strengthen it the moment they feel the signal is coming out of Washington. I think I will finish by saying that, do we think that this plan, this proposition will be adopted? Will the US administration endorse it? What are the chances? These are the questions we will get from you, I suppose. But I think we needed to say what needs to be done as opposed to what so far has been done and is likely to be the policy in the coming months. Thank you.
Well, thanks everyone for coming and listening to us today, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for letting me participate in this project. And thanks to Fred for giving me the easy task of outlining what a force would actually look like and how it might operate inside the country. I guess I would start with the idea here that the administration, many people in the administration and elsewhere are fond of saying there's no military solution to the Syrian problem. I guess what I would say, and I think my colleagues would agree, that there's no political solution to the Syrian problem unless there's a military component to it. That is, there has to be a force involved to create conditions in Syria for a political solution, for a political outcome. So that's sort of I think the underlying idea behind some of this. A second point would be that anyone who proposes a force for stabilization force for Syria, whatever, has to be able to answer a number of questions, about that force. What we've seen is an enormous amount of hand-waving about the train and equip mission without really getting into specifics about what that would entail and what the outcome of that process would be. And I just touched on a couple of questions that we raised in the paper. And the first, I think, and most important question is for any force going into Syria is, what's the mission? What is the force going to be built for, and what is it supposed to achieve in a military sense when, on the ground? Is it going to be just fighting against ISIS? Is it going to have a combined mission, ISIS and regime? Is it simply going to be there for humanitarian purposes? What is the mission of the force? You have to be able to answer that question, and I think we've, my two colleagues have already addressed it. A second critical question is, what level of capability is this force going to be built to attain or to reach? The train and equip mission, we've heard about, we don't have a lot of details, but it's a 15,000 man force. There's no specification of what kinds of weapons, how it'd be organized, or anything else. But so you have to be able, if you're proposing a force for Syria, you have to be able to say, okay, what is this thing actually going to be able to do? What will be its combat capabilities? A third, I think, major question is, and Bassma touched on this and addressed it, is who's going to set the strategy and who's going to lay out the operational plan for the force? You don't have a situation where one day you finish training and equipping and then you deploy and operate, right? There has to be an actual plan, a concept, a strategy with operations to implement it, for this force to have any kind of serious effect. We don't see that yet for the 15,000 man force that's being talked about. But it's absolutely critical. One of the huge gaps in the armed rebellion against the regime is that there is no national strategy by the Syrian opposition for fighting the war. It's a war that's conducted by multiple groups in multiple places for their own purposes. There's no strategy, and there's no plan of operations to implement the strategy. What you have is a lot of low-level stuff, a lot of tactical stuff, and occasionally some operational level stuff. And then the fourth question I'd focus on here is, how would the force actually relate to other forces operating inside Syria? You have, maybe 1,000 different armed groups or so. You have them on an enormous spectrum from moderate groups to Islamic extremists, whatever. So how and who is going to say this is how you will work with the forces inside Syria, or work against them, or ignore them? So those questions, if you're designing any kind of force to work in Syria, you've got to be able to answer those. And there's some other more technical military ones, and they're in the report. But at some point the hand waving has to stop, right? You actually have to say, this is what the force is going to look like, this is what it's going to be capable of doing, and this is how it will be operated. I think there are like 3 sets of important mission factors that would drive the size and capabilities of a force that could be effective in there. The first set is what I call force to task. How big is the force going to be, and what are its capabilities going to be related to what it actually has to do? And when you look at what would have to be done by the kind of force we're talking about in Syria, it would have to be able to conduct defensive operations, offensive operations, security operations, and humanitarian operations. Those are all things that the force is going to do. It's not just going to go in there and put up its tents and start talking to people or negotiating with people or whatever. It's going to have to do some very specific and important military missions. A second factor that dictates or influences the size and capabilities is the force to space ratio. Syria is not a small country. It has all kinds of different terrain, 14 provinces and so on, urban terrain, rural terrain, desert terrain. So if you're talking about a force to go into Syria, whether it's 15,000, 50,000, or 300,000, it's going to be spread over this space, right? And all space is not equal. Some spaces are, different for military reasons than others. But you have to think about, okay, if I've got 15,000 troops or 50,000 troops or however, how does that actually line up with this territory in Syria? Okay? They can't all be in one spot. And the third set of what I call mission factors is the force to opposition, right? There's different sets of opposition inside Syria. You've got ISIL, right? You've got the regime components left. You've got various extremist groups like JN, and then you've got kind of the this dog's body of different warlords and local fighters and so on. So all 4 of those groups of people could have to be engaged under some circumstances, by the force. So we're not just talking about fighting ISIL. We're not just talking about fighting the regime. We're talking over time, over the period of the forces in existence, of maybe having to fight all those, and maybe having to fight some of them simultaneously. So, that indicates you need kind of a significant force. So what are the design principles? I think that we came up with anyway for this. And I have to emphasize, we're not trying to build Patton's Third Army, right? We're not trying to build the army that invaded Iraq, the Third Army that invaded Iraq in 1983. We're trying to talk about kind of a plausible force that could be built and could be, operationally and tactically effective on Syrian battlefields. So we're not. You could say, well, yeah, it'd be nice to have 300,000 men. Sure, but does anyone in this room think it's likely that we'd ever approach a force, that size, trained and equipped by the United States and so on? So we, figured that a force of approximately 50,000 Syrians could do a lot of what we're talking about. In some scenarios and under some conditions, it might require, a lot more. And we acknowledge that in the paper. But 50,000 is a reasonable planning figure for a force that would be effective on Syrian battlefields. And this also reinforces what Bassma said, is this is a Syrian force for a Syrian war, right? We're not talking about an expeditionary force of Americans or Brits or whomever. We're talking about Syrians being the people in the force, commanding the force on the field and so on. And it's designed for the Syrian war. It's not designed for large-scale warfare in Central Europe, with lots of tanks and armor and that. It's designed to fight the kind of war that we actually see in Syria with the kind of weapons and similar kinds of units. We believe it should be uniformly equipped, right? If you look at the Syrian rebel forces or opposition forces, they have everything under the sun in terms of weapons. Homemade weapons, some of which are effective, some are not. U.S. weapons, British, European weapons, Russian weapons mostly. We believe it should be uniformly equipped to make it easier for a lot of process. We figured on a triangular structure, right? That is, the units would be built up, from the bottom up, with 3 companies, 3 platoons, 3 companies, 3 battalions, 3 brigades, 3 divisions, right? So this is a fairly simple and proven military structure. The emphasis here is on a field or maneuver force, right? This is a force for combat. It would have other roles. It would have a humanitarian role to protect humanitarian supplies and so on in its areas of responsibility. And it would have a security mission, that is to prevent massacres of the people and so on. But the basic and fundamental of the job of the force would be to fight, at least until the main fighting was over. We wanted to imbue it with a full range of ground capabilities. That is, it can conduct different kinds of ground combat with facility. We believe that beginning with the battalion level, the units would have some capability for independent operations. That is, you could start introducing battalion level formations into Syria for specific roles, and they would have the inherent capability, to carry out those missions. And we also built in a non-combat, the humanitarian and security mission capability, because that needs to be there, starting at at a fairly low level, and we began that at the battalion level for the force. In terms of the key equipment requirements of this force, Fred said, described it as a motorized, infantry division. It is not an armored division, right? We did not build in heavy armored elements, for combat. The rebels have a few, weapons and armored vehicles and so on, but not very many, and we didn't put that in because of the huge logistic cost tail and the operational, difficulties of dealing with that kind of force. What we did build in was a lot of mobility, so that the 50,000 men could get around Syria, with some degree of efficiency or speed. They already have, the rebel forces in Syria already have that. They're highly motorized in the sense that they have all kinds of vehicles for moving their troops. That could be standardized. It could be made, the vehicles could be better than the ones they have and so on. But the idea of being able to deploy rapidly from various battlefields in Syria, we think is important. So you would have operational mobility. That is, you can move from one province to another province or one battle to another province with facility. And you'd have a lot of tactical mobility. We build into the force a lot of firepower, right? This is critical on the Syrian battlefield, is being able to outshoot the other guy in terms of a lot of different aspects of that. We built in anti-tank guided missile units and forces. This is the response to what's left of the regime armor. Rebels already use these kinds of weapons a lot. We built in anti-aircraft capability. Now, this could be anti-aircraft guns, which the rebels have now, but they don't know how to use very well. They don't use them very effectively, especially in the ground-to-air role. And we also acknowledge, presumably, possibly, whatever, perhaps, they could be provided, since these would be our guys, they could be provided with anti-tank guided missiles. And they need the ability, anti-aircraft missiles. So they would need that capability. They would have to have the capability to defend themselves to some extent, greater or lesser, against the Syrian Air Force. Obviously, the more air power that's put in by the U.S. or whatever, the less that capability might have to be used. But they should have that capability. And we built in a light artillery capability. And by light, I mean mobile. This is guns up to 122, 130 millimeter capability. This is to offset regime's advantage in artillery and give the rebels the ability to conduct indirect fire on regime positions, something that's critical to their offensive capabilities. And then we stuck in, other things as well, like heavy engineering vehicles. Engineering warfare is important on the Syrian battlefield, so they need heavy engineering equipment. And there's a bunch of other things as well. In addition to equipment, which often gets the most of the attention here, is there are a number of sustainment processes. Again, I don't think in the Syrian context, you're not talking about building a force, sending it in, and that's it, right? The force, it would be in combat potentially over a long period of time. It would take casualties, it would expend ammunition, lose equipment, and so on. So the whole force would have to be sustained by funding, recruitment, replacement of personnel and equipment, continuous training, resupply of ammunition and spare parts, and even such simple things as personnel issues, right? One of the long-standing issues with the rebel forces is how do you take care of the people involved in terms of rest, awards, pay, their families, and so on. So all that sustainment package has to be considered and has to be built in. For external support requirements, that is things that people outside of the SNSF would provide, is the first and most important is air support, right? This is strike activity, reconnaissance, ISR, so-called, and mobility, the ability to redeploy forces either inside Syria or from one front to another, like the northern front, say, to the Jordanian front. The force would need to receive strategic and operational intelligence. We didn't build in a huge intel package. It's there for the tactical level stuff, but it would need that kind of the ability to situational understanding of what the enemy's doing and so on. It would need a capacity for strategic movement. That is, you could move a component of the 50,000 from one major front to another. Again, say from the northern front of the Turkish area to the Jordanian area. It needs the ability for strategic planning. I said earlier that this is something that the rebels lack, is the ability to actually do strategic thinking, strategic planning, and strategic operations. They would have to be given that capability. And then there's that whole kludge of public affairs, information warfare, all those kinds of things that we did not build into the 50,000 man force, but would have to be there. I said at the beginning that one of the key things here is commitment. The force actually has to be committed to battle, right? It's not just going to sit on the Syrian border, and it's probably not all going to show up one day in Syria in mass, right? So you have to think about how the force would actually be committed to operations inside Syria. So our principles were that any commitment of any part of the force would have to be based on a clear guidance from the command structure and in the context of a coherent plan of operations. That is, they wouldn't be committed willy-nilly. They wouldn't be committed at the hands of local commanders. They wouldn't be committed for necessarily or hopefully for purely political reasons. They would be committed to battle inside Syria with some sort of operational concept, plan, strategy, whatever. We believe that small forces should not be committed. Right? The Syrian battlefields are lethal. There are a lot of fairly capable forces on those battlefields. So we think you would want to avoid committing, say, company-sized units or below, except under very particular emergency kind of circumstances. We believe that the missions could grow over time, that the forces would get better, and the missions would improve, would become more complex and difficult as they gained in size and capability. And we believe they would have to cooperate with other rebel forces. That the 50,000 man force alone could not do all the things that we're asking of them. We looked at an approximate timeline of 24 to 36 months from the beginning of actual, having something in hand to commit, maybe to the end of successful operations. That's that's kind of a guess or an estimate of what might be necessary. But if you think about it, that lays out a 3-year battle for Syria, right? The war's been on for 4 years now, so 3 additional years could seem like a long time, or it might seem like a relatively short time, because hopefully something would actually get accomplished in that time, that the situation would be changed. I'm getting the indicator to wrap it up here, but I think you can talk about a force for Syria and throw numbers around, but I think you really have to, if you get into this discussion, you really have to address the questions I raised. You can't, as I said, at some point you have to stop the hand waving and say, this is what it will actually look like, this is what we'll be capable of doing, and this is how it would be involved in the fighting. So far, we have not had that discussion. I'm presuming that I know there are other types of forces that could be proposed. You could propose a third army, right? And take 3 years or more to build it before it was even ready for initial commitment. I mean, but at some point you have to actually sit down and say, this is the kind of force we're talking about. This is the kind of force that can do the job. So, thank you all.
Thank you. If I may take the privilege of pushing you each a bit more before opening to the floor for questions and comments. We are where we are today. The United States is in terms of its policy towards Syria with Europe because of a mountain of public suspicion, lack of faith that anything we do can make things better, and most things that we do from experience with Iraq, Afghanistan, can make things worse. It's hard to persuade the skeptics that an investment of, let's say in this case, only treasure and attention, diplomatic engagement. Let's not even talk about boots on the ground famously, but we are talking about air support and possible need for military support, at least at some remove. A paper like yours seems to me is an attempt, you're grabbing public attention, it's an attempt to overcome that skepticism and that suspicion. Meetings like this are the same. Each of the speakers have pointed out the difficulties and the contradictions here. The paper makes clear, and your various comments made clear, on the one hand, the leadership, the organization, the commitment must come from within. It must be a Syrian enterprise. On the other hand, what looks like a contradiction, which I think you've resolved, at least the paper does, that the United States must lead. Not only Europe, but Europe with the United States. The United States must make a clear policy direction and decision, not in contradiction to what, Bassma, you acknowledge is not something the Syrians are comfortable with or particularly like, but they need to see a clear direction ahead and believe it to motivate themselves. So you have a chicken and egg sort of thing, and it doesn't look like either of those conditions is in place right now. So to address the skepticism that anything we do can actually have the impact that's called for, what evidence do you have beyond hope that additional United States commitment? All of us have seen Hillary Clinton herself, John Kerry himself, Robert Ford himself. I've witnessed it. I've been within it. Fred Hoff, I've seen your work, Bassma, within the opposition. What can you adduce by way of evidence to persuade skeptical polities in the United States, to say nothing of Europe, that increased engagement, getting behind a plan like this, will produce the results that are desired? Number one, and sort of under that, for those of us who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan and places where there were American military interventions, I know the difference. I know we're not arguing for that kind of intervention here. What was obviously the hardest part is what you said, you acknowledged the ISAF would have to also deal with, not only helping to precipitate a change of regime, but then to build and stabilize afterwards. The failure that Robert Ford saw so painfully in Iraq and I saw, also in Afghanistan, is the civil affairs portion. Your paper cites the need for that, but doesn't go into the kind of depth, and Jeff, also just in your remarks now, the kind of detail on what kind of preparation, equipment, training, a civil affairs entity, a governance fomenting, protecting, nurturing entry. So against all this, what reason should a President Obama, should an American public have to believe that with more American support for a proposition like the Syrian National Stabilization Force, that will work to move the American polity beyond palliative care, as it were? Some might call it benign neglect. Just give us something more positive out there to explain why this is the right way to go.
I'll take a very brief shot on the business of evidence that something like this will work. I think none of us is prepared to sit here and say this is some kind of a, if I mix metaphors here, a shake and bake silver bullet for all of this. In one of the chapters, we describe in painful detail the diplomatic heavy lift that's going to be required to bring this about. There is absolutely no guarantee of success. I mean, there was no guarantee of success when when Americans landed at Normandy, when Americans undertook the great twilight struggle of the Cold War. There are no guarantees here. What we've seen that's guaranteed is the state of Syria and the state of Syria's neighborhood. After 4 years of trying desperately to hold this situation at arm's length in the hope that something will turn up somehow, that there will be a political process entering from stage left. Now, what we've managed to do in the last couple of days is brief privately senior officials in various parts of our government. We have gotten what I would say is across the board pretty positive response to this. People are looking, if not for answers, if not for pat answers, they're looking for ideas. They've been handed a mission by the commander-in-chief. They're trying to make some sense of it, okay? So at least I think what we have now in the White House, in the Pentagon, and in the Department of State is a common lexicon based on this, where some of these things can be sorted out on an interagency basis and perhaps taken action on. But I am not here to suggest that this is some kind of fairy dust or silver bullet. This will be enormously difficult, not the hardest thing the United States has ever undertaken. By far not the hardest thing. But just the avoidance of stupid stuff is not necessarily a positive way forward.
If we try, we may fail. If we don't try, we will fail.
We will.
Mm-hmm. And Bassma, you had mentioned also that you've been very honestly addressing the lack of coherence within the political opposition, within the armed opposition, and for that matter, the collaboration between those two sides. Over the years that you've been at this, have you seen any coalition happening with the increased American engagement, shifts in the Turkish approach? Do you see exogenously or indigenously any precipitating of greater collaboration around a shared way ahead, or is it still as far apart as I remember it when I was in office and was dealing with it?
The quick answer, I think, would be emergency makes it happen. And typically we have, at the moment, the new situation in the city of Idlib, which after 3 years almost of liberation of all of the province, and there remained the city itself that the regime forces controlled, and there was an administration that the regime managed out of the city. And the regime withdrew under pressure from the military groups, but also on its own decision, probably to regroup. This is a different discussion. But basically, a new situation emerged in Idlib. And what we see is immediately how the military groups who played the major role try to impose their law and order. And by law and order, I mean specifically that what they demand is that they be in control of security and the judiciary. And that's quite interesting. But then we see also the civilian population immediately organizing themselves, talking with the military groups to agree on the space that they can control in order to administer civilian affairs away from the military groups. And these groups are agreeing to that. Probably they don't have the capacity. They have no interest in managing the city. So we have, in fact, this immediate organization of civil military affairs. I'm not saying it's ideal. It's far from ideal, because the groups on the ground are not the ones we like. Yet the civilians are trying to push those boundaries and saying, over time, we will be able to have our own policing, our own security forces, and we will be in control. So governance becomes an absolutely vital component of it. And in such a plan, we will also need to definitely define that. This is where I think we have thought of a European role, where there is a long experience in many areas of the world in combining civil military affairs. I just want to come back to your point of how do you overcome skepticism. I think we have seen the results of inaction, and Frederic Hoff was alluding to that in his comment. But I would say there's also, if one thinks of the alternatives, if we think for a minute of the alternative, if we receive the message as Syrians, go to the Russians, go to the Iranians, talk to them and see what you can get from them, the end result may well be that we will reach some agreement with them with a lower ceiling, much lower ceiling than our demands. But if we want to save the country, we will go for some of their demands. What would be those demands? They may well be some demands that Syrians will want to agree to because they want to save their country, but they could not please at all, neither the United States nor some of our neighbors. And I'm thinking of channeling weapons to Hezbollah through Syrian territory is a likely demand by Hezbollah and Iran. Should we refuse if we are left with no alternative? So we are looking at future interest, long-term interest of various powers in this region and security interests of key players in this region, which I think really pleads for a serious strategy.
Frank?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, on the, it would be a very important phase here, a local phase, national phase, whatever, of transition, from kind of combat operations to defeating various bad guys, to establishing governance and security for the population and so on. At the first point of that, right, it's a matter of strategy for the Syrian political leadership, right, is to build that into the concept of how they're going to operate, or how they're going to achieve that when the fighting is over in a particular area, or even when it's on. The French took about 3 years to plan for going back to France, and when the Normandy, so they'd be ready for the Normandy invasion and ready for the Free French to reestablish order inside France. So this is a major not just combat, but actually governance inside France. So this has to be thought about. It has to be part of the strategy. I don't have in mind that the Syrian National Stabilization Force would have a soldier on every street corner. They would be there to back up those political authorities that are supported by this the Syrian national leadership, to provide additional firepower, additional capability to suppress people who are opposed opposing the reestablishment of order and so on. So I think it's, it's something that it needs to be done. The paper that hasn't been written is the paper on the strategy for the liberation of Syria, right? And all these kinds of things, would need to fall into that discussion.
There's all kinds of people who would like to. And I would have given Robert Ford the first option, but I don't see your hand going up to identify sins of omission or commission. You're the that can do it. Maybe start from the back, maybe work forward. Dan, sir.
Daniel Sherwood from Johns Hopkins SAIS. If I'm buying it, how much does it cost?
It's a good and really difficult question, and I thought about it, and I didn't have a really, I think, compelling, ultimate answer. It would cost a lot more. Right? It's a lot more, right? We're probably talking, talking multiple billions here, not including the air support and that kind of a package. So this is not a cheap proposition. I looked at some of the data for how much it costs to train and equip an Iraqi brigades that we've been working on. It's like $89 million per brigade. The somewhat later standard than we're a significant later standard, at least in terms of our costs and what we're proposing here. So you very quickly add up for the kind of force we're talking about. Money adds up. And there's also, as I mentioned, the sustainment. It's not a one-shot deal where you have one package of $1.5 to $2 billion. That gives you your force, and then you can forget about it. You don't have to write any more checks. It's a 3-year effort.
Dan, we don't have the sense that this is a long-term exclusive commitment by the American taxpayer. Okay, if this concept is embedded in an overall strategy that our partners in the Gulf and elsewhere have been screaming for years now, I sense that burden sharing will be a major aspect of this.
The room and the media, Reuters.
Hi, Warren Strobel with Reuters. Just to follow on that very point, Fred, I assume you've pre-briefed or briefed the findings to U.S. allies in the region. Gulf Arab money, Turkish troops will be needed in all this. What's been the reaction? Are they willing to step up if the U.S. provides the political leadership? Thanks.
We've discussed the overall concept with some European interlocutors in particular, with some Turks. I've had very brief conversations with some Gulf people. I would say overall the response has been non-committal so far, as well it should be. I mean, that's quite sensible. People wanted to see the final product. The final product is in place, and I think we're going to be very much involved in informal, obviously unofficial consultations over the next month or two.
Hands are seen in order: Joseph Barhout and Judith Kipper.
Two Syrian questions. The first one has to do with the absorption mechanism of rebellious groups that would feel that they are put aside of this. Would it take a regional cooperation by their patrons or etc.? What is the mechanism you envisage? The second one is more important. It has to do with the aftermath of a potential liberation of Syria. Bassma, you know well the political culture of your country. It's a country where putschism is, let's say, entrenched in the tradition of armed forces. What would be the guarantees that we would escape such a thing, and what are the signals to give to the Syrian society at large and the Syrian opposition society more specifically that it won't be reiterated, that this body is not a future political player?
Okay, on the absorption of fighters, I think it's a combination. Here again, I don't see the strategy implementable unless there is active cooperation in good faith of the regional players, because you need to reduce resources to certain groups, to divert these resources to serve this strategy. You need them to curb these groups. It's not easy because they may have some autonomy for a while and they can go on for a while, but not for very long. And I think it does take a good 6 to 8 months or perhaps 10 months to change the configuration as a result of diverting resources in some directions. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen. In fact, we already see it happen. We've seen it in the south very clearly. The south of Syria has been really shaped by the diversion of resources towards certain groups. So this is possible, and it's quite possible in the north. It may be even quicker in the north because we have a diversity of groups, again, which do not have the support of the population. So it is really a question of resources. So that's one aspect. Your second question, I'm going quickly here because I don't think we have much time to go into detail. I think this indicates one aspect of it. Part of these groups need to be engaged. And again, this is the role of the advisory task force. You need to have people within that task force who have the right language, the right approach, the right knowledge, the right rooting in the communities to be able to engage these groups on grounds that they understand, with language that they would hear. And with that, and then the message is clear. This is happening. It has to be a sense of something is coming. Are we part of it or are we outside? Are we going to fight it or are we going to be fought? So I think it's this indication also which is going to develop some incentives. Again, I think Jeff White was indicating this is not a force you develop 50,000 men outside and you move them in. What you do is a gradual process that basically creates new dynamics on the ground. So you have to create that magnet. For the moment, the magnet is radical groups. But if you want to create, you want to reach this, I think you can start by creating a magnet with a discourse, It can't go without a clear discourse about what the intent is. I think that can create new dynamics on the ground. The second point, there's no guarantee that an army tomorrow will stop, but the real guarantee here, first of all, this is under some command that is difficult to rebel against. So I don't see that this can be a force that takes over. Now, if it has capacity to restore law and order, it also operates under a Syrian advisory task force, and it comes into being thanks to the role of this advisory task force. That advisory task force disappears afterwards, but we have a national command authority and we have a political leadership that needs to emerge as a result. They will generate a political leadership rather than say the political leadership is not connected to the groups on the ground. That's how I see it, and maybe that's the guarantee against a coup. If there's a coup, there'll be people in the streets again, as we had in 2011.
I suggested Judith, and then wrap up.
Thank you. First, I think we all need to thank the Atlantic Council for this report and bringing the Syrian dilemma back to the public policy debate. Many years ago when I came to Washington in one think tank, it's a factor to give a kick in the pants to the government, especially those based in Washington, and so little has been done in the last 4 years, and Syria deserves this attention. I'd like to address my question to Fred. Fred, the humanitarian crisis is desperate, to say the least. It obviously, addressing that problem where it exists inside Syria and in the neighboring countries has very large strategic implications for what all of you are talking about. It's something that can be accomplished a little quicker than the 2 to 3 years that Jeffrey White has said a force of 50,000 would require. Do you see any possibility of the U.S. being the leader in organizing, not necessarily doing or paying, but organizing a massive humanitarian help for the Syrians? And maybe you could just answer to, because I'm very confused. How does the U.S. government reconcile the ISIL-Assad relationship when we're fighting ISIL and leaving Assad now? It appears to be, quote, a force for stability or against chaos. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I think the humanitarian abomination that's taking place in Syria is the challenge of our time. And I think my own government should take a careful but accelerated look at the possibility of some kind of humanitarian military intervention that will not require dropping the 82nd Airborne Division onto Damascus, will not require American boots on the ground, but will give some effect to the words that politicians always like to use when it suits them. Never again. Never again. What's happening there, and our failure to respond in ways that I believe entail very little risk to American forces. I think that failure is grievous. And believe me, as a Vietnam veteran, as somebody who served in the Lebanese Civil War, I'm not looking for new and different ways to employ the 1% of our population that are doing the heavy lifting for all of us. But there are ways that I think this can be addressed.
There are lots of questions. We'll offer the panelists the option to either take one more question or do a wrap-up. Which would you rather do, respond to a question or a wrap-up?
Do a question.
Oh, we'll do one more. There's a gentleman here with a check shirt that I don't recognize. So.
Thank
Your
you.
name, please. And
Sasha Simonov, People Demand Change. Two quick questions. One is, pragmatically speaking, vetting. Civil society activists that get vetted right now, sometimes it still takes 2 months. When you're talking about vetting former fighters or current fighters, it's maybe an even longer process. A lot of times when we speak with State Department, they say, look, the lawyers tell us our counterterrorism laws just don't allow us to do and be flexible with our policy. So pragmatically, how do you get around that, and do our counterterrorism laws really allow for that to happen? Second thing, with Syrian Advisory Task Force, do you envision this being with Syrians from inside Syria or the external opposition? Because I think the trap is, if it's the external opposition in charge, we end up with the same problems as interim government and the Itilaf. Thank you.
Thanks, Sasha. Bassma is going to give the bulk of the answer to your question. I would just observe that in my experience in government, government attorneys generally find a way to implement that which their client wants.
In 2 words, there is some detail about that, not enough in the report. Again, this advocates a certain approach, a certain strategy. Not every aspect of it is detailed as to become operational. Who these individuals would be, I think we specify that they need to have credibility and I wouldn't say legitimacy. The word legitimacy is really problematic in the Syrian context, but they will build legitimacy functionally because they will be serving a certain role. In that, I think it's a combination of inside and outside, and we do need to have the full trust of the American, those leading the American strategy, to be comfortable with this group, because they will be, of course, the screening will happen a lot through this group. It is to broaden the pool of potential fighters that this advisory task force can, that's the main role it actually can serve.
Just a quick point on that. In my view, and not speaking for anybody else, we're going to have to relax the standards. If we want to create a significant body of combatants in a reasonable, period of time, we'll have to accept more risk. It's just, it's a problem. We might have to deal with some people that some others might say are Islamists, right? because to get the forces you need, you know, for the fight, both in the 50,000 and people you can work with inside the country, you know, you can't have a CT mentality.
If I may take advantage of the presence of this group with the expertise and the special interest to do two quick commercials. One, Faisal Itani is here. Faisal will be presenting another paper on Syria and ISIS. Syria. And al-Nusra on the 28th, time to be determined, and invitations yet to go out. We have a very small specialty focus event on Monday the 20th with the president of the Turkish Disaster Relief Agency, the sort of FEMA equivalent of Turkey, Dr. Fuat Oktay. It is very small, and I honestly don't know if there's space left, but if there are those, several asked about the humanitarian aspect of this. He handles, there's north of 1.7 million Syrians in Turkey, about 45% of the Syrian refugee populations in Turkey. 250,000, moving up to 1/3 soon, are in camps run by this man's organization. If there's anyone that we've missed in terms of invitations who are interested in the humanitarian relief aspect of this by a big league player, please let us know, and if there's more space, we'll be glad to extend an invitation. Thank you all very much.